What happens when a single aircraft punches through the most heavily defended airspace on the planet, alone at night, in weather so bad the defenders assumed nobody would fly? The radar operator at a North Vietnamese early warning station southwest of Hanoi saw something he couldn't explain. A single return, moving fast, barely above the treetops. The time was approximately 10 p.m. local on October 30th, 1967. The blip wasn't behaving like anything in the pattern books. American strikes came in packages. 20, 40, sometimes 70 aircraft in coordinated waves with dedicated jamming support, Iron Hand, SAM suppression flights, fighter escort, the whole orchestra. A lone contact, skimming the karst ridgelines at 500 knots, didn't fit any known American attack profile. By the time the scope showed the contact crossing into the Hanoi engagement zone, it was already too late to do much about it. The North Vietnamese air defense network around Hanoi was, by late 1967, arguably the densest integrated air defense system ever assembled outside the Soviet Union itself. American intelligence assessments from that fall counted over 200 SA-2 guideline missile sites within a 30-mile radius of the capital. Thousands of anti-aircraft guns, 37mm, 57mm, 85mm, 100mm, ringed the city in overlapping kill zones. Soviet-supplied P-35 Barlock and PRV-11. SideNet radars fed target data to a centralized command structure that could vector MiG-21s from Phuc Yen or kept airfields in minutes. The North Vietnamese had studied American tactics for 2.5 years by this point. They understood the strike packages, the predictable ingress routes dictated by rules of engagement coming out of Washington, the fact that American pilots were forbidden from hitting certain targets, forced into certain corridors, and generally required to announce themselves electromagnetically long before they arrived. A Soviet advisory team embedded with the Air Defense Division had helped design the network specifically to exploit these patterns. The SA-2 batteries were positioned to create overlapping engagement envelopes along the routes American aircraft had to fly. The whole system was built on a reasonable assumption that American air attacks would arrive as large detectable formations following predictable procedures. Nobody had planned for what Lieutenant Commander Charlie Hunter and Lieutenant Commander Lyle Bull were doing that night. Their A-6A intruder, Bureau Number 1, 52612, assigned to VA-196 aboard USS Constellation, was inbound to the Hanoi Rail and Highway Bridge Complex, carrying 28 Mark 82 500-pound bombs. One airplane, 2 men, no jamming support, no flak suppression, no MiG escort, no nothing. The aircraft's DIAN, Digital Integrated Attack Navigation Equipment, was flying them through weather and darkness along a computer-generated route that hugged terrain features, threading between known SAM sites at altitudes where the SA-2's minimum engagement envelope couldn't touch them. The guideline needed its target above roughly 1,500 feet to achieve a reliable track solution. Hunter and Bull were at 200. The operational concept behind this mission had been dismissed by plenty of people who should have known better. Grumman had designed the A-6 specifically for this role. Solo, all-weather, low-level precision attack. But the Navy's own tactical doctrine in 1967 still favored the massed Alpha strike. The idea that a single medium attack aircraft could penetrate to downtown Hanoi without the protective cocoon of an entire carrier air wing struck many senior officers as somewhere between reckless and insane. One after-action summary from the Air Wing's records uses the phrase calculated risk in a way that reads more like an institutional hedge than an endorsement. The intelligence officer who briefed the mission threat assessment that evening, his name doesn't appear in any document I've been able to locate, would have laid out the SAM order of battle, the AAA concentrations, the MiG alert status. The numbers alone were enough to make the case that this was a one-way trip. But the A-6 had something no other aircraft in the American inventory could match in October 1967. And it wasn't speed or firepower. It was the ability to find a target the size of a bridge span in zero visibility, at night, at 200 feet above the Red River Delta, while flying at 8 miles a minute. The Diane system was either going to justify every dollar Grumman had spent developing it, or Hunter and Bull were going to die proving the skeptics right. At Grumman's Bethpage plant on Long Island, the engineers who built the A-6 knew exactly what the fleet thought of their airplane. The mock-ups had gone through review in 1958. First flight came on April 19, 1960, and from the moment naval aviators laid eyes on the thing, the reaction was almost universal. It looked wrong. The fuselage was bulbous, and the nose drooped. The wings were straight in an era when swept wings meant speed, meant survival. Fighter pilots called it the drumstick, among other things. The A-6 couldn't break Mach 1 in level flight. Its top speed was roughly 640 miles per hour, which put it slower than the F-8 Crusader and the F-4 Phantom. Slower, in fact, than aircraft the Navy had been flying for a decade. In a service culture that worshipped speed and agility, the intruder arrived looking like a delivery truck, which, in the most literal sense, it was. The Marine Corps had actually driven the requirement. In the late 1950s, Marine aviation planners wanted a jet that could find targets in zero-ceiling weather over a jungle battlefield and put ordnance on them accurately. Day, night, monsoon, fog didn't matter. The Navy picked up the requirement and expanded it. What emerged from Grumman's design team under Bob Nafis was an aircraft built entirely around its avionics suite. The airframe was almost secondary. Every dimension of the fuselage, every curve of that ugly nose, existed to house and protect the Diane system and give its two-man crew the workspace to operate it. The pilot sat left, the bombardier navigator right, side by side in a wide cockpit that felt more like an office than a fighter. No tandem seating, no macho single-seat mystique. Two men sitting next to each other, reading instruments, managing a computer. Diane itself was, I keep wanting to use stronger language here, a revolutionary integration of 5 separate subsystems. The AN/APQ-92 search radar handled navigation and ground mapping. The AN/APQ-112 track radar locked onto specific aim points with a beam narrow enough to distinguish a bridge pier from the riverbank beside it. An AN/ASN-31 inertial navigation platform provided continuous position updates independent of external signals. A digital ballistics computer, one of the first ever installed in a tactical aircraft, calculated release solutions accounting for airspeed, altitude, dive angle, wind, bomb drag coefficients, and weapon type. A radar altimeter fed precise height data into the whole loop. These 5 systems talked to each other through an analog-digital hybrid architecture that Grumman's engineers had essentially invented from scratch because nothing like it existed anywhere in 1959. The bombardier navigator ran all of it. His job was staggering in scope. While the pilot held altitude and heading, the B/N was cycling between radar modes, updating navigation fixes, refining the target track, monitoring terrain clearance, and managing the weapon's release sequence, all simultaneously, all at 200 feet, all in the dark. The right BN made the system sing. Put a mediocre one in that seat, and he could fly the aircraft into a hillside. The washout rate in A-6B/N training was brutal, and the records from VA-42, the East Coast Replacement Air Group Squadron at Oceana, suggest that nearly a third of candidates couldn't hack the workload. Lyle Bull was not mediocre. He had over 400 hours in the right seat of the intruder by October 1967, and a reputation within VA-196 as one of the sharpest bombardier navigators in the Pacific Fleet. The squadron's maintenance logs from that deployment aboard Constellation show something interesting. When Diane systems went down on other aircraft, and they went down constantly. The reliability was atrocious in the tropical humidity. Bull would sometimes sit with the avionics technicians and help troubleshoot, an officer doing wrench-turning work, which tells you how well he understood the guts of his own system. The pilots trusted him. Hunter trusted him specifically, and the two had been flying together long enough that the crew coordination was nearly automatic. The irony of the A-6's reputation problem was that by 1967, the intruder was doing things no other aircraft in the American inventory could even attempt. Alpha strikes against Hanoi area targets were losing aircraft at rates that made Pentagon planners physically uncomfortable. The figures from Route Package 6 during the summer of 1967 work out to roughly 1 aircraft lost per 40 sorties over the most heavily defended zones. The A-6, flying alone at night, was achieving comparable bomb damage assessment results with a fraction of the exposure. Fewer aircraft, fewer crew at risk, same bridges dropped, and the mission didn't require a 30-plane strike package to pull off. But the jet still looked like a delivery truck, and carrier aviators still snickered at it in the ready rooms. Nobody was snickering on the night of October 30th. So what exactly were Hunter and Bull flying into? The comparison to Moscow wasn't rhetorical. It was analytical. A classified Defense Intelligence Agency assessment circulated in mid-1967, portions of which were declassified in 1981, explicitly stated that the Hanoi-Haiphong corridor contained a higher concentration of surface-to-air missile batteries per square mile than the Soviet capital itself. Moscow's air defenses were designed to stop Strategic Air Command bombers flying at 50,000 feet. Hanoi's were designed to stop tactical jets flying at 15,000. The engagement geometry was completely different, and in many ways the North Vietnamese problem was easier to solve. Their targets were slower, lower, and obligated by Washington's rules to fly predictable routes. The SA-2 guideline was the backbone. Each battery consisted of 6 launchers arranged in a star pattern around a fan-song fire control radar, with reload missiles stored nearby on transport vehicles. A full battery could put its first missile in the air roughly 6 seconds after the fan-song achieved track. The missile itself weighed nearly 5,000 pounds, carried a 287-pound fragmentation warhead, and detonated on proximity fuse, meaning it didn't need a direct hit. The kill radius was approximately 200 feet. At the altitudes American strike aircraft typically operated, between 10,000 and 18,000 feet, the SA-2 was devastatingly effective. Its minimum engagement altitude sat around 1,500 feet, and below roughly 3,000 feet, the tracking solution degraded badly because the fan-song radar struggled with ground clutter returns. This was the gap the A-6 crews intended to exploit, but flying below the SAM envelope meant flying into the guns. The anti-aircraft artillery around Hanoi operated in a layered system that the North Vietnamese had refined through years of practice against American aircraft. The heavy 85mm and 100mm guns were radar-directed, using fire can and whiff radar sets that could compute lead angles automatically out to effective ceilings above 30,000 feet. Below them, the 57mm S-60 batteries filled the middle altitudes, and below those, down where Hunter and Bull would be operating, the 37mm automatic cannons and 14.5mm heavy machine guns created a nearly continuous curtain of steel from the surface to about 5,000 feet. These weapons didn't need radar. At 200 feet, a gunner could hear the jet coming, point at the sound, and hold the trigger down. The volume of fire was the weapon, not the accuracy. American post-strike photography from missions over Route Pack 6 regularly showed images where the sky above Hanoi appeared physically textured with flak bursts. One reconnaissance pilot's debrief from September 1967 described the AAA over the city as a solid gray layer, like an overcast, except it was all steel. The integration between these layers was what made the system so lethal. Soviet advisors had helped the North Vietnamese build a centralized command and control structure that linked early warning radars, SAM batteries, Tumber AAA regiments, and MiG interceptor bases into a single coordinated network. When an American strike package was detected inbound, the entire system activated in sequence. Early warning radars would acquire and track. Ground control intercept officers would scramble MiGs to force the Americans to jettison bombs or break formation. SAM batteries would engage at medium and high altitude, pushing aircraft down into the AAA envelope. The guns would handle anything that came low. Each layer drove the attackers into the kill zone of the next. Pentagon loss projections for single aircraft missions against Hanoi area targets in late 1967 are difficult to pin down precisely. The specific numbers remain classified in the operational planning documents I've been able to access. What survives in secondary sources, staff officer memoirs, naval aviation histories published in the 1980s, suggests that mission planners assigned solo penetration flights against the capital a survival probability somewhere around 50%. Per sortie, flip a coin, and that estimate assumed the aircraft's navigation and attack systems worked perfectly, that the weather was bad enough to degrade visual tracking, but not so bad that the Diane couldn't function, and that the crew didn't make a single error at 200 feet in the dark over unfamiliar terrain surrounded by karst ridgelines rising to 4,000 feet. Hunter and Bull had flown this route before. The coin had come up their way every time so far. Hunter's going to kill himself and Bull doing that low-level stuff. One night, the terrain clearance isn't going to work, and they'll fly straight into a ridge. The pilot who said this, a fellow A-6 driver in VA-196, quoted in a squadron history compiled after the deployment, wasn't being cruel. He was being honest about the math. At 200 feet and 500 knots, the margin between a successful bombing run and a smoking hole in a limestone hillside was measured in fractions of a second. The Diane system's radar altimeter updated fast, but terrain in the Red River Delta approaches wasn't flat farmland. It was karst, jagged, irregular, rising without warning. A 2-degree nose-down error held for 4 seconds at that speed meant ground contact. Hunter didn't care. Or rather, he cared about something else more. Lieutenant Commander Charles B. Hunter had come to VA-196 with a conviction that the A-6's designed mission profile, solo low-level night attack, was being systematically underutilized because squadron and air wing leadership didn't trust it. The Navy kept folding intruders into Alpha Strike packages, sending them in at medium altitude with everyone else, which negated every advantage the aircraft possessed. You took the slowest jet in the air wing and put it at 15,000 feet in daylight, where every SAM operator and MiG pilot could see it. Hunter thought this was idiotic. His word reportedly was stronger. He and Bull had been refining their low-level tactics for months before the October mission. Bull would spend hours before a flight plotting routes that threaded between known SAM engagement envelopes, using terrain masking from ridgelines and river valleys to break line of sight with fansong radars. The routes looked insane on paper. Dogleg turns through mountain passes, altitude changes timed to specific terrain features, approach headings calculated to minimize time spent in any single AAA batteries engagement cone. Other crews in the squadron flew low-level missions too, but Hunter and Bull pushed lower, stayed down longer, and chose routing that left less room for error than most BNs were comfortable calculating. The skepticism from within VA-196 wasn't universal, but it was real. The squadron's commanding officer gave Hunter latitude to develop the tactics, which suggests at least tacit institutional support. But the ready room culture ran against them. A-6 crews who preferred the relative predictability of medium-altitude alpha strikes viewed Hunter's profile as unnecessary risk-taking. The losses were going to come regardless. Why volunteer for a mission type that turned every navigational hiccup into a potential fatality? Bull's answer to this, as near as I can reconstruct it from second-hand accounts, was characteristically technical. The loss rates proved his point. Alpha strikes over Route Pack 6 were bleeding aircraft. The low-level night missions weren't. The sample size was small. VA-196 had only been flying these profiles for a few months, but the trend was hard to argue with. Every crew that went downtown at 15,000 feet in a strike package was gambling against the entire integrated defense network at once. Hunter and Bull were gambling against terrain and their own avionics. And terrain, at least, wasn't trying to adapt. They preferred those odds. 14 hours before launch, the target assignment came down from CTF-77 aboard Constellation, the Canal des Rapides Bridge, northeast of Hanoi proper, carrying both road and rail traffic from China into the capital. Alpha strikes had hit it twice already that month. Both times the bridge survived. Both times aircraft didn't come back. Now a single A-6 would try it at night. The mission brief was held in VA-196's ready room aboard Constellation on the afternoon of October 30th, 1967. The details that survive come from squadron records and from accounts given by other crews who were present. Hunter laid out the route himself, while Bull handled the navigation charts and radar predictions. Fighter escort was out of the question. The F-4s couldn't operate at 200 feet in instrument conditions and would only add radar cross-section to the package. There would be no Iron Hand SAM suppression flight either. The A-4s loaded with Shrike anti-radiation missiles were tasked to Alpha strike support the following morning and couldn't be pulled. The EA-3 electronic warfare aircraft that might have jammed Fansong radars overhead weren't available. Hunter planned to hit a KA-3 tanker on the recovery end if fuel allowed, but none was dedicated to the mission. 1 airplane and 2 men. 18 Mark 82 500-pound bombs on multiple ejector racks. Total ordnance weight just over 9,000 pounds, which put the intruder near its maximum combat load and made the aircraft sluggish on the controls, particularly in the kind of hard maneuvering turns Bull's route demanded through the karst approaches. The weather briefing was the one piece of good news, if you could call it that. A low-pressure system was pushing ceiling down to 800 feet over the target area, with visibility under a mile in rain and mist. This was terrible weather for visual bombing, but it was equally terrible for the defenses. Optically aimed AAA would be degraded. MiG intercepts were unlikely. The SAM operators who needed visual acquisition to supplement their radar tracking at low altitude would be working half-blind. The overcast was the best thing Hunter and Bull had going for them. Diane didn't care about weather. The track radar would paint the bridge piers through rain the same way it painted them through clear air. Bull had verified this on previous missions. The system's performance actually improved slightly in precipitation because the heavy air reduced certain types of radar interference at close range. The room went quiet during the threat portion. Bull walked through the known SAM sites along the route using the most current intelligence overlay, which was already 72 hours old and therefore suspect. We counted at least 7 active SA-2 batteries within tracking range of the final approach leg. One crew member recalled afterward. 7 batteries meant 42 launch rails. The AAA order of battle was worse. An estimated 14 automatic weapons positions within 2 miles of the bridge itself, plus whatever mobile guns had been repositioned since the last reconnaissance pass. Bull's route threaded through a river valley on the approach, using ridgelines to mask the aircraft from 3 of the 7 SAM sites until the final 90 seconds before weapons release. Those last 90 seconds were naked. No terrain masking. The aircraft would be in detection range of at least 4 Fansong radars simultaneously, while Bull held the track radar locked on the bridge and the ballistics computer ran its solution. Bull had to hold the aircraft exposed for 90 seconds on the final approach, which sounds abstract until you consider that a proximity-fused SA-2 needed about 6 seconds to cover the distance. Everyone in the room could do the math on the odds. The subject didn't come up. The crew members present remember Hunter closing the brief with something about the weather being too bad to waste, meaning conditions this favorable for a low-level night attack might not come again for weeks. Bull folded his charts. They walked to the aircraft. The catapult fired at 9:47 p.m. 17 tons of loaded intruder went from standing still to 150 knots in 2.5 seconds. Hunter's helmet slammed back against the headrest. The Steamcat on Constellation's No. 2 bow shuttle was notorious for rough shots, and this one was no exception. The acceleration hit somewhere around 4 Gs, hard enough to blur vision, momentarily even braced for it. Then the shuttle released, the deck edge disappeared, and they were flying over black water with no horizon. Night carrier launches are an act of faith in instruments. There's no visual reference. The vestibular system in the inner ear lies immediately. Without a horizon line, the body cannot distinguish between climbing and banking, between level flight and a gentle descending turn into the sea. Spatial disorientation kills more naval aviators than enemy fire in most years of most wars. Hunter's scan went to the attitude indicator the instant the catapult released, and it stayed there until the intruder was climbing through 500 feet, with a positive rate confirmed on both the barometric altimeter and the radar altimeter. Only then did the breathing slow down. Bull was already working. The BN's station in the A-6 sat slightly lower and to the right of the pilot, surrounded by the greenlit displays of the Diane system. His primary scope showed a circular radar picture that painted the ocean surface below, and as they climbed and turned west, would begin resolving the coastline of North Vietnam. He was running the navigation system through its initial alignment checks, verifying that the inertial platform hadn't drifted during the catshot. Catapult launches were rough on inertial navigation. The sudden acceleration could introduce errors that compounded over distance if not caught early. Bull's post-launch checklist took about 90 seconds. The system was holding. They rendezvoused with nothing. No tanker outbound. No escort forming up on their wing. The radio was quiet except for Constellation's departure controller handing them off to Red Crown, the radar picket ship in the Gulf of Tonkin that monitored all aircraft movements in and out of North Vietnamese airspace. Hunter checked in with a brief call sign and mission number. Red Crown acknowledged. From this point forward, radio silence unless something went wrong or Red Crown detected MiG activity along their route. The descent began 40 miles from the coast. Hunter pushed the nose over gradually, trading altitude for the concealment that low flight provided against North Vietnamese early warning radars. The P-35 Barlock and P-12 Spoonrest radars that formed the outer detection ring of Hanoi's air defense network had theoretical detection ranges against low-flying aircraft of about 25 miles, depending on terrain and atmospheric conditions. Below 500 feet, ground clutter swallowed most returns. Below 200 feet, an aircraft was effectively invisible to these systems unless it flew directly over the antenna. The lower Hunter flew, the later the defenses would know he was coming. The cost was reaction time. At 200 feet and 480 knots, a ridgeline that appeared on Bull's scope at 4 miles would arrive under the aircraft in 30 seconds. They crossed the coast, feet dry, at 11:08 p.m., roughly 60 miles south-southeast of Hanoi. The radar altimeter read 200 feet. Rain was hitting the canopy in sheets now, the low-pressure system delivering exactly the weather the briefing had promised. Hunter could see nothing outside the cockpit. He couldn't see the coastline passing beneath them, or the rice paddies, or the first low hills beginning to rise to the west. His entire world had contracted to 6 instruments: attitude indicator, radar altimeter, airspeed, the course deviation needle that Bull was feeding from Diane's navigation computer, and the 2 engine gauges in his peripheral vision. Bull's world was the scope. The green sweep painted terrain returns that he matched against the predicted radar picture he'd computed before the flight. A laborious process of hand-drawing what the radar should show at each waypoint based on topographic maps and known radar reflectivity of different terrain types. If the picture matched the prediction, they were on course. If it didn't, they were lost at 200 feet in the dark over enemy territory. The picture matched. Bull called the first waypoint on time, then the second. The intruder banked left into the river valley that would carry them northwest toward the target. 42 launch rails across 7 batteries, 10 of them fired. The first raw stroke lit Bull's warning panel 22 miles from the bridge. A Fansong tracking radar had found them despite the terrain masking. Bull called it. Hunter held altitude. At 200 feet, the SA-2's guidance system faced a problem its Soviet designers had never prioritized solving. The missile's minimum engagement altitude was roughly 1,000 feet. Below that, the radar's ground return overwhelmed the target return, and the proximity fuse couldn't distinguish between an aircraft and the earth beneath it. The SA-2 was built to kill B-52s at 60,000 feet. It was not built for this. Hunter dropped to 50 feet. 50 feet is not a tactical altitude. It is an altitude where the radar altimeter needle is bouncing against a number so small that turbulence alone could kill you. A hard gust, a moment of inattention, a wing dip from turbulence, an updraft off a warm ridgeline, followed by the downdraft on the other side. Any of these puts the aircraft into the ground before the pilot's hands can move. Hunter flew there anyway because the math worked. The SA-2's proximity fuse detonated the 440-pound fragmentation warhead when the missile passed within 200 feet of a target. At 50 feet above the ground, a missile descending toward the aircraft would fuse against the earth before it reached them. The ground itself became a shield. The first 2 missiles came off the rails at 11:14 p.m. Bull saw the launches as brief flares on the radar scope. The SA-2's solid rocket booster burned for roughly 4 seconds and produced a signature bright enough to paint on ground mapping radar at close range. He called them. Hunter held course. At their altitude, the missiles were somebody else's problem. They would either fuse high or drill into the rice paddies. Both detonated above and behind the aircraft. The concussions were audible through the canopy. Then the sky opened up. Between 11:14 and 11:16, sources give slightly different timestamps, and I'm inclined to trust the post-mission debrief over the intelligence reconstruction. 8 more SA-2s launched in a ragged sequence from at least 3 different battery positions. The North Vietnamese operators were doing something unusual. They were salvo firing in pairs, walking the missiles down toward the deck in what appears to have been a deliberate attempt to bracket the intruder's altitude. This wasn't standard Soviet doctrine. Standard doctrine called for 3 missile salvos against a single target with staggered fusing. What the Vietnamese were attempting was more like barrage fire. Fill a volume of sky with fragmentation and hope the aircraft flew through it. It didn't work. The physics wouldn't let it work. Missiles that descended below 200 feet fuse triggered against the ground. Those that held above 200 feet detonated too high for the fragmentation pattern to reach an aircraft at 50 feet. Hunter had found the gap in the system. No electronic countermeasures, no evasive maneuvering, just the geometric fact that a proximity fuse cannot function when the ground is closer than the target. 10 missiles, 0 hits, 12 miles to the bridge. Bull called 12 miles and locked the track radar onto the bridge. The scope picture sharpened as Diane shifted from navigation mode to attack. The Canal des Rapides bridge resolved as a hard, bright line across the river return, concrete piers reflecting radar energy like mirrors against the diffuse scatter of moving water. Bull adjusted the cursor, centering it on the southern abutment where road met bridge deck. The ballistics computer began its countdown. Airspeed, altitude, wind drift, bomb drag coefficients, Release interval for 18 weapons across 5 ejector racks. Diane processed all of it continuously, updating the release solution 10 times per second. Bull's job was to keep the cursor on the aim point. The computer would handle the rest. 12 miles at 480 knots, 90 seconds. The AAA started at 8 miles. Hunter saw it before Bull did. The tracers were visible even through rain, red and orange streams arcing up from both sides of the river in a pattern that meant barrage fire rather than aimed tracking. The 37mm and 57mm guns couldn't see the intruder. Their crews were firing on radar cues from the Fansong sites, hosing predetermined boxes of sky with high explosive shells, and hoping geometry did what aiming couldn't. The shells were detonating above and around the aircraft in bright orange flashes that strobed through the canopy and turned the rain into something that looked, according to Hunter's later account, like flying through the inside of a furnace. Hunter held the aircraft level. He had to. Any maneuvering, a bank, an altitude change, even a momentary jink, would sew Bull's radar cursor off the aim point and corrupt the ballistics solution. The computer needed stable flight parameters to calculate release. Bull needed a steady platform to hold the lock. Everything they had survived to reach this point depended on Hunter flying straight and level through the barrage for another 60 seconds. 60 seconds of holding still while the sky tried to kill them. Bull was talking. The intercom recordings don't survive, but crews who flew with Bull on other missions described his target run pattern as a low monotone. Range callouts, cursor corrections, system status, delivered in a voice so flat it sounded bored. 8 miles, tracking, 6 miles, solution good, 4 miles. The voice was a lie, of course. Nobody is bored at 50 feet over downtown Hanoi. But the monotone served a purpose. It told Hunter that Bull had the lock and Diane was computing, that the system they'd staked their lives on was doing what it was supposed to do. A 57mm shell detonated close enough to shove the aircraft sideways. Hunter corrected. Bull's cursor stayed on the abutment. 2 miles. Release in 10. The bombs came off in a ripple sequence at 11:19 p.m., 18 Mark 82s separating from the racks in pairs over approximately 1.4 seconds, the aircraft lurching upward as 9,000 pounds departed the airframe in a stuttering series of jolts. Hunter slammed the stick left and pulled, banking hard into a descending turn that took them below the AAA engagement floor and back toward the river valley they'd used on ingress. Behind them, the first bombs struck the southern span 1.2 seconds after release. The string walked across the bridge deck from south to north. Post-strike reconnaissance conducted 2 days later by an RF-8 from VFP-63 confirmed what Bull's scope had suggested at the moment of release. Direct hits on the bridge deck, the southern abutment shattered, and at least 2 spans dropped into the river. The airplane nobody wanted, flown by the crew nobody picked, had just done what 2 full Alpha strikes couldn't. Get us out of here. Hunter said it to nobody. Bull heard it anyway. The left bank tightened to nearly 60 degrees as the intruder dropped back below 100 feet, nose pointed southeast, the river valley opening ahead of them like a dark corridor. The bombs were gone. The aircraft was 9,000 pounds lighter, and the 2 J-52 engines responded to Hunter's throttle shove with an eagerness the loaded airplane hadn't possessed on the way in. Airspeed climbed through 500 knots. The wings flexed in the turbulence rolling off the valley walls, rain still hammering the canopy so hard that the sound competed with the engines. The defenses didn't stop. They intensified. The Fansong radars were still tracking. Bull's RHAW panel showed 3 separate strobes, 2 ahead and 1 behind, which meant they were flying between SAM batteries on the egress route. More launches. Bull called 2 missiles at their 7 o'clock, rising fast, but already behind the aircraft's velocity vector. At 500+ knots and 50 feet, the intruder was outrunning the tracking solution. The SA-2's guidance radar needed several seconds of steady tracking to compute an intercept, and Hunter wasn't giving them several seconds on any heading. He was jinking now. Shallow S-turns within the valley, never more than 20 degrees of bank, just enough to deny the radar operators a predictable flight path while keeping the aircraft inside the terrain, masking of the riverbanks. The missiles detonated somewhere behind them. Bull didn't bother calling the impacts. The AAA was worse than the missiles on egress. The gun crews along the river knew the aircraft had to follow the valley. The terrain on either side rose to ridgelines that would kill a low-flying jet faster than any shell, and they were firing into the corridor with everything available. Tracers crisscrossed ahead of the aircraft in overlapping streams. Hunter flew through gaps that existed for fractions of a second. A 37mm battery on the north bank opened up at what couldn't have been more than a mile of slant range. The muzzle flashes visible as yellow-white pulses in the rain, the tracers floating up with that deceptive slowness before accelerating past the canopy. Hunter held low. The shells passed over them. At 50 feet, the guns couldn't depress far enough to track an aircraft that was essentially below the barrels. The valley widened after 14 miles. The ridgelines fell away into the coastal plain, and with them went the terrain masking that had kept the intruder alive. Hunter pulled the aircraft up to 200 feet, still below the SA-2 engagement floor, but high enough to clear the low hills between the river delta and the coast. The RHAW panel was quieter now. One fan song still painting them, but the strobe was weakening with distance. No more launches. The gun emplacements thinned as they left Hanoi's defensive perimeter. Feet wet came at 11:31 p.m. 23 minutes after the catapult shot had put them over the Gulf, they were over the Gulf again. Bull ran a battle damage check through the aircraft systems, hydraulics, fuel quantity, flight controls, engine instruments. Everything read normal. Hunter cycled the flight controls manually, feeling for sluggishness or asymmetry that might indicate structural damage the gauges couldn't detect. The airplane flew clean, not a single hit. 10 SA-2s, hundreds of AAA rounds, 92 minutes over or near the most heavily defended airspace on the planet. A gauntlet of radar-guided fire on the egress, and the aircraft didn't have a hole in it. They trapped aboard Constellation at 11:58 p.m., the number 3 wire. Hunter's heart rate, if anyone had been measuring it, was probably still somewhere north of 140. The engines wound down on the flight deck. The canopies came up into the rain. The plane captain who chained the aircraft to the deck walked the entire airframe with a flashlight. He found nothing. He couldn't find shrapnel damage, bullet holes, FOD impacts, nothing at all. He walked it again. Same result. The aircraft looked like it had been on a training hop. Word moved fast on a carrier. By the time Hunter and Bull climbed down from the cockpit, the squadron's commanding officer was on the flight deck. The debrief account records his reaction as brief. He looked at the aircraft, then at Hunter. "Did you get the bridge?" Hunter said they got the bridge. The CO stared at both of them for a long moment. Then, according to at least 2 squadron members present on the flight deck, "You're both crazy, and I'm putting you in for a medal." The citations smelled like mimeograph ink, that sharp chemical tang that clung to Navy paperwork in the 1960s. The same smell as a duty roster or a parts requisition, because the bureaucracy that processed heroism used the same machines it used for everything else. Both awards came through faster than anyone expected. The Navy Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor, went to Hunter and Bull individually, each citation running about a page and a half of the kind of language that military prose uses when it's trying to describe something it doesn't fully have words for. Hunter's citation noted extraordinary heroism and exceptional courage in the face of intense, hostile fire. Bull's used almost identical phrasing, but added a line about the navigation and weapons delivery being accomplished with unprecedented precision under conditions of extreme duress. The word unprecedented did a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. What it meant was, nobody had done this before, and the Navy wasn't entirely sure how they'd done it now. The ceremony itself was brief. Carrier award ceremonies always are. Flight operations don't pause for medals. Hunter and Bull stood on the flight deck in khakis, the wind pulling at the citation pages, jet exhaust from a launching Phantom washing over the assembled officers with that acrid kerosene heat that sticks to fabric for days. The Admiral pinned the crosses. Handshakes, photographs where both men look vaguely uncomfortable, which is how naval aviators always look when they're not in a cockpit. But the real award wasn't medal on a ribbon. Within 6 weeks of the Canal des Rapides strike, Comnaverpac revised its tactical employment guidance for A-6 squadrons. The revision authorized single aircraft night missions against defended targets as a primary rather than secondary tasking. Squadrons that had turned down intruder assignments were now requesting them. Squadrons that had treated their intruders as daytime bomb trucks started training for low-level night penetration in earnest. The doctrine Hunter and Bull had been developing on their own. The terrain masking, the altitude exploitation of SA-2 fusing limitations, the split-second pop-up delivery profiles, the reliance on Diane for blind weapons release, became standard fleet procedure. The A-6 would go on to serve for 34 years. It flew in every American conflict from Vietnam through Desert Storm, where intruders knocked out bridges, airfields, command bunkers, and scud sites with the same blind bombing capability that had put 18 Mark 82s onto a bridge span in the rain over Hanoi. It outlasted the Phantom, the Crusader, and every other jet that had been considered cooler. Hunter and Bull flew 14 more missions together before their combat tour ended. The records don't say whether they ever discussed that night at length. 34 years of service, 693 aircraft built, 12 combat deployments to Vietnam alone, and dozens more to every other theater the Navy cared about. And the fleet called it the Tadpole. Not officially. You won't find Tadpole in any Grumman brochure or Navarre designation document. The name came from the flight deck crews who watched the A-6 waddle to the catapult on its squat landing gear, that bulbous radome leading the way like some oversized amphibian nosing through pond water. The Phantom guys called it worse things, but after the Canal des Rapides strike, the nickname picked up a modifier, Iron Tadpole, the ugly thing that wouldn't die and couldn't miss. The North Vietnamese rebuilt the bridge. They always rebuilt the bridges. Construction crews had the southern span back in service within 19 days, working at night under camouflage netting, replacing the shattered abutment with wooden cribbing and steel plate. The reconnaissance photos from early December show truck traffic crossing again. This was the grinding arithmetic of the air war over North Vietnam. You knocked something down, they put it back up, you knocked it down again. The Canal des Rapides bridge was struck 14 more times before the 1968 bombing halt. A-6 crews handled most of those missions. The North Vietnamese adapted too, or tried to. After Hunter and Bull's raid, SAM batteries along the Red River Valley received new low-altitude fusing kits from Soviet advisors. The documentation on this is thin. A couple of intelligence summaries from early 1967 that reference modified proximity fuse settings without specifying the technical details. Whatever they changed, it didn't work well enough. A-6 loss rates on night single aircraft missions stayed lower than Alpha Strike loss rates through the end of Rolling Thunder. The math that Hunter and Bull had bet their lives on held up. An odd tangent here. The A-6's Diane system shared a computer architecture with the UNIVAC 1218, a machine originally designed for submarine fire control. The same basic computing logic that tracked Soviet ballistic missile submarines was tracking bridge abutments in the rain over Hanoi. The engineers at UNIVAC's St. Paul facility, who designed the 1218, probably never imagined their submarine computer flying at 50 feet above a river delta at 8 miles a minute. Or maybe they did. Engineers are strange people. Anyway, back to the crew. Hunter and Bull both made commander. Both finished their tours, rotated stateside, and did what naval officers do. More assignments, more squadrons, the slow institutional grind of a career measured in fitness reports and duty stations rather than individual nights of terror. The Navy Cross citations went into their service records alongside everything else. Promotion boards would have seen them. Whether those citations carried more weight than a strong fitness report from a flag officer is the kind of question the Navy prefers not to answer directly. The A-6 community became something different after that night. Before Hunter and Bull, intruder squadrons were where you ended up. After, they were where certain pilots wanted to be. The ones who preferred the problem-solving of all-weather attack to the air-to-air glamour of the fighter community. VA-65, the Tigers, produced more than its share of those pilots over the next 2 decades. The squadron's ready room developed a culture that prized the BN as an equal crew member rather than a passenger, which sounds obvious, but was unusual in naval aviation at the time. Bull had proven the BN wasn't along for the ride. The BN was the weapon. The Canal des Rapides Bridge still stands. It carries Route 1B across the canal northeast of Hanoi, rebuilt in concrete and steel sometime in the 1970s, handling commercial traffic now. Trucks cross it every day. The drivers don't think about what happened there. Hunter retired from the Navy in the early 1980s. The exact date varies depending on which source you check. The Naval History and Heritage Command has one date. A Squadron Association roster has another. He settled in Virginia, not far from the Navy's institutional center of gravity around Norfolk and Virginia Beach. Bull retired around the same period. Both men attended squadron reunions into the 1990s. The morning after the Canal des Rapides strike, Constellation's Air Wing launched a full Alpha strike against a supply depot near Than Hoa. 28 aircraft carrying 16 tons of ordnance, standard formation, standard tactics, standard results, standard losses. 2 planes went down. The war continued at its usual pace, as if one airplane hadn't just rewritten the manual the night before. The next A-6 night mission launched 36 hours later. Different crew, same airplane.